Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Kayla and it's time to crack into a good book. So today, obviously, we have Ivey back, and I thought we would do a little discussion about Blood of Elves by Andrzej?
Andrzej
Sapkowski. So this is like the first real book, I guess, in the Witcher series. So like, what I mean by that is like, it's not a short story collection. So we recently listened to this on audiobook, and obviously since we listened to it together, I thought this would be good for a discussion, so I'm not going to hold this up the entire time. Ivey has already read all of the Witcher books so far, and
I read them all probably about 5 to... Well, the most recent one only came out in English a couple years ago, but I read the main story arc within the last 5 years, but I don't remember as much as I thought I would.
So this is my first time reading them. We watched the show together, and he's played some of the video games. I have not. I have The Witcher 3 on PS4, but I haven't played it for some reason.
I haven't finished it. I don't think anyone's finished it.
Yeah. It seems like a lengthy game. So I think we'll just start off kind of generally like, what was it like listening to it again, and like how much of it did you remember, I guess, and...
So,
I don't know,
it's hard. I think part of the reason I don't remember a lot of it is because there are a lot of time skips, and it's sort of just told as like vignettes in the characters' lives that may be a year later or maybe 6 months later, and you kind of have to piece together from context clues when it's happening relative to other things. Because most of the characters are like mysteriously ageless. Like everybody that has magic just glamours themselves to always look young. Geralt doesn't really age since he's a mutant witcher, and even Dandelion, who's like the bard, they always talk about how he's like mysteriously youthful for someone his age. So no one except for Ciri, no one ages at all. So it's kind of hard to stay grounded into what, and it's got the usual fantasy tropes of like it takes forever to go anywhere. So it's hard to remember what happens when, because you barely even know when it's happening when you're reading it.
That's fair.
So I think that's part of why I didn't remember the story as well. But, I mean, it definitely... I remember the broad strokes. A lot of the stuff came back.
Yeah. Well, kind of on that note, I did notice, like, I was confused about when things were taking place in here, and, like, if there were time skips within this book itself. And part of it is, like, you know, listening to it on audio, I don't have the best audio retention, so, like, compared to reading it or whatever. So I think there were times where I spaced out a little bit, and I was like, oh god, what's happening, you know? Ooh, is it snowing?
It's like, kind of sleeting.
Sleeting, yay! we'll leave that in. What would you rate this book out of 5 stars?
3.5 or 4, probably.
That's exactly where I'm at.
It's good. It doesn't have... Like, there's not a huge amount of action necessarily, but the action is pretty well written. It's all, I mean, if you've experienced anything with The Witcher, it's really dancey, fast sword, talking about precise strokes and stuff. It's cool. It's kind of different. It separates itself from like the usual just sort of brutal hacking at each other medieval combat. But it doesn't really have much... Like, there's one part that has a little bit of the witchery, like, monster hunting stuff, but it's more of a setting the table for some of the relationships, like Geralt and Ciri and the main enchantresses and the witchers. And also sort of setting up the personal conflict Geralt has with the other people looking for Ciri. But a lot of it has to be world building because it's all set in the backdrop of a giant... impending invasion by this one empire is going to take over these sort of fractured
Nilfgaard,
Nilfgaard. Nilfgaard's going to take over, or plan, you know, in the early stages of their invasion to take over these fractured northern kingdoms, which is where all the action happens. And so you get some political plotting and stuff, which is a central part of the whole series. And you know, it's a lot of it has to introduce all the characters. There's a lot of people scheming in a lot of different directions, and so it's got a lot of legwork to do setting the table, I think. So it's hard to really have much progress in the story while you're doing all that.
Yeah, I think I rated The Last Wish, which was like that first story collection, 3.5 stars. And this one I rated, I think, 4 stars. And I think a lot of that actually is because of the audiobook. Like, I really enjoyed my experience with that audiobook, and I think that like really helped, and I'm kind of interested in continuing the series on in that way, because I think the narrator does a really good job. It's a lot of setting things up, and Weirdly enough, I don't feel like this featured Geralt as much consistently throughout the book as I was really anticipating. Like, it seemed to be a lot more about Ciri than I expected. And I've been kind of talking with Angela from Literature Science Alliance about it, and she was like, even in some of the later books, like, Ciri isn't also the focus, so I'm like, well, who is the main character then if we're not focusing on Geralt or Ciri?
So, Ciri, I would say Ciri's the main character of the whole Ciri in the series. But because just the way the other characters are written, Geralt and Yennefer's probably the second most famous character people know, and Triss is also very important in the books. Most of their character development has already happened, and so you just hear about it. Whereas Ciri is like growing up, coming to terms with being a magical source and being a girl witcher, and like still dealing with PTSD from, you know, the slaughter of her people. And so Ciri has a lot more like growing and finding herself to do, whereas Geralt is pretty much fully formed at this point. The only thing he develops is like actually caring about others. Geralt doesn't really develop much, so it's hard to say he's the main character.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And they're all interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so when you first read these books, did you start with the short story collections? Okay. Did you read both of them or just The Last Wish?
One of them comes later in the continuity. What's the second one called?
I think it's Sword of Destiny.
Yeah.
The other
Sword of Destiny comes later in the continuity, but they're all kind of told, like I said, they're all kind of told like short stories where you kind of come and go on characters.
That's accurate.
Yeah.
So what was interesting is I don't think The Last Wish really introduced Ciri at all. So like I had seen the show before reading, you know, Blood of Elves, so I knew who she was and I kind of knew about like the invasion of, was it Sintra or Citra? Sintra. So, like, I also, like, don't know how anything is spelled either because we listened to this one on audiobook. I was like, oh, God.
Also, a real mismatch of, like, all the Western European medieval cultures and the main languages. So, like, the elves basically speak Gaelic, and, like, there's some other weird liberties taken, but it's good.
But, yeah, so I think it was helpful for me, I guess, having watched the show to then go into this, because, I knew what had happened, and, like, I knew Ciri.
Sorry.
Because, like, otherwise I don't know if, like, you hadn't watched the show. I don't know if it would make sense to go from, like, The Last Wish into Blood of Elves, and then, like...
So, just for context, the show is basically the first book of the core series picks up right after the show would have started. Basically, Geralt has found... The show is a story of Geralt finding Ciri after Sintra is destroyed, and the books are the story of after Geralt has found Ciri, like, trying to train her, trying to figure out how she's going to fit in to his life.
Or at least season 1 of the show. I have no idea what's going to happen next.
Season 2 is different.
Yes, season 2 is not out yet. Who do you think your favorite character is?
Well, I know who my favorite character is in the series, but he's not here yet. I always like the dwarves. They kind of bring some realism to it, because everybody's super racist. All the humans are super racist, and the dwarves kind of work with them. You know, they can be blacksmiths. But the elves have pretty much given up on that shit, and they've gone into guerrilla warfare. Some of the dwarves do. Some of the all the magical races are kind of starting a guerrilla terrorism campaign in earnest at the outset of this book.
And there's like a little bit of that throughout the book, I think, as well. There were a couple of scenes, I think, throughout the story where, like, Ciri, I think, was learning about this group and, like, what they stand for, and she's kind of questioning if that's something that she supports as well.
And they're a central part of the games, too. Geralt is big into being neutral, so he's not racist himself, but he doesn't tend to... He views himself as just there to deal with, like, monsters threatening people, doesn't care what kind of people they are, but he doesn't like to deal with interpersonal, like, two sentient groups fighting each other, unless he's got to do it to further some other goal of his. Yeah.
So what I thought was interesting, and, like, I mean, the show, it's very evident also that, like, elves are looked down upon, and, like, it, you know, kind of mentions that in here as well, but there's like, obviously it's called Blood of Elves, and one thing that, like, really stood out to me while listening to it is, like, certain phrases are repeated a lot. Like, it's like the elder blood, the blood of elves, like, that was constantly repeated. And it seems like they're making a really big deal out of this, and...
It's a lot of prophecy.
Yeah, well, and it's just interesting to me to, like, have the elves be kind of looked down upon, but then, you know, we have this, like, whole blood of elves situation that seems to be, like, really important, so it's like, I don't know, it's just kind of jarring.
So the elves are looked down upon largely just as a scapegoat by the crappy kingdoms, because it's not fun to be a serf for anyone. But the people who know what's up, like Nilfgaard is fine with elves, and mages are also fine with elves, because the elves taught people magic. The racist stuff is really just like the lowest people are racist because it's a nice distraction for the people in power, in a lot of cases.
Interesting.
Prophecy stuff does tie in nicely. It's important for all those phrases do mean things, and you do get to figure out what it means. It's not just gibberish.
Not just gibberish. Yeah, I think so. I guess in terms of the characters, I mean, I do wish Geralt had been in here more. He seems mostly just kind of broody again, but that's what he is, I guess, yeah. I can't remember if Triss was at all in The Last Wish. She's kind of loosely, I think, in the show, but not nearly as much as the focus as Yennefer, but she seems really interesting, and I wish we had gotten more of her also. She's, like, kind of in there a little bit as, you know, Geralt is trying to find somebody to help with Ciri, and then she's gets sick.
Yennefer's a bitch, and Yennefer is hard to deal with. So Geralt calls Triss first because Triss is generally...
She does seem a lot nicer. Though, like, I don't know, I think it's interesting having, again, watched the show before reading this book. Like, I think the show... I don't know what that is. The show has kind of influenced, I think, my opinion of Yennefer somewhat. But, like, in here, in the book, she didn't seem all that bad. Like, she's definitely haughty, I think. But she's not...
Thing. They're all like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, that's just really a sorceress thing, I guess.
Triss.
Except for Triss, okay. She doesn't seem unlikable, so I'm curious to see, like, what happens with her in the books.
Yeah, she becomes more likable throughout the books.
Yeah. Well, she seems like, particularly towards the end, to kind of bond more with Ciri and, you know, develop, like, a little bit of a friendship and actually care towards her.
That's what I was talking about, the room for growth. Geralt and Yennefer... really they're kind of aloof and like to seem like invincible and fully formed, but their relationship with Ciri sort of actually shows some cracks in that, I guess.
Yeah, and I also liked Ciri. Like, I enjoyed watching her in the show, and it's fun to see her here. She's like training to become a witcher and like learning about her abilities and everything like that. Like, it was really amusing. There's like scenes, you know, where she's like training to sword fight and like training to like keep her balance on things and perform all these moves, and it's just like, I don't know, I just thought it was kind of funny, and she just like gives no shits about whether or not she's like beaten up by these, like, what are they called, like the
pendulum and the,
yes.
There's another one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Windmill. The windmill and the pendulum, yes. Is it Triss or Yennefer who's like, oh my god, you're covered in bruises?
Triss, yeah,
okay, Triss. And Ciri's like, yeah.
I
just need to get. I need to be faster. It's like I can appreciate that sort of attitude. Like,
and it's definitely, if you've seen the show, she's raised by her grandma, so that
who is a badass.
Yeah.
Yes, Calanthe is pretty.
The only monarchs in this series. Okay, first of all, everyone's super horny, and yeah, it's clearly written by a dude.
Yeah. Oh my god, what was the phrase? I think like Triss.
She was determined not to sleep alone for one more night or something.
There were several like moments of that with, I think, Triss and maybe Yennefer, where like I actually did laugh out loud while listening to it, because like, oh my god, this is so ridiculous.
All the Enchantresses especially are super horny, and they are even more horny for Geralt. And he gets like passed around like a dog toy.
Oh my god.
But I was gonna say, the only, I guess there's maybe like King Foltest is kind of okay. He's just one of the monarchs. But what I was gonna say is the only monarchs who are actually likable are females. Calanthe is dead by the time of this because this is after Centrafell, but there's another one, Queen Neve, who is also. They just the Lady Monarchs get shit done. The Dude Monarchs just kind of bicker and talk about marriages and shit, and get manipulated by the sorceresses who flirt with them.
Mm-hmm. Now, so we got to see the bard who... Okay, so this is one thing that's really interesting. In the audiobook, the narrator pronounces his name Dandelion.
Yeah.
But it's spelled Dandelion.
Yeah.
And I think
in the show, it's...
Jaskier or something like that?
which is the Polish name. So they just stuck with that.
Yeah.
He's comic relief. And he's funny.
He is funny. And, we get to see him certainly at the beginning. And I think
he likes horse.
Oh my god. A couple of times throughout the book, but mostly at the beginning, I think, where people are trying to track down Ciri, and then he's so they're interrogating him because they're like, oh, you have this story about Geralt and Ciri, so obviously you know where they are, so tell us and stuff. He's trying to escape, and then kind of gets trapped and struggles a bit. He seems pretty funny, and I don't know. We haven't seen too much of his interactions with Geralt, right?
No, it's kind of a bit. Well, the show developed that really well. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a Geralt actually likes him, but at first it was kind of you're really annoying, but the publicity kind of helps. So I guess I won't not let you follow me around. But then they just sort of, again, it's hard to keep track of the timelines. But every few years, at some point in the story, they just cross paths and hang out for a bit. And Dandelion tends to surprise with, when you think he's just stepped in it completely, he shows some shred of honor or actually does the right thing. Oh, so he's very likable.
Yeah, I guess in terms of the story, you kind of mentioned how it just feels almost like a short story, vignette sort of structure, I guess, which I agree with. There's, I guess, more of a coherent... it's all about, Ciri, mostly, training and stuff like that. But it does feel like we're kind of, one story arc and then, another situation with, she's training at, the Witcher... what is it?
Kaer
Morhen. And then she eventually goes to this other school thing, and then she's traveling...
It's a temple.
A temple, yes. And then she's traveling with Geralt and, kind of then... I guess this is before she goes to the temple.
He takes her to the temple.
Yeah, so, on the way, they encounter, the resistance fighters, essentially, and...
It happens linearly, but there are skips.
Yeah.
And so, after the part where he's taking her to the temple, the next time you see Geralt, it skips a few months ahead, and he's just, hanging out on a barge looking for river monsters.
Yes. Yeah, so I liked that part, the actual hunting of the river monsters, and there's, this one scholarly dude who's oh, well, there's no way that, such a creature could exist, and Geralt's nah, bro, it definitely exists. And then, of course...
You can call it whatever fancy names you want. I know what it looks like and how big its teeth are.
Yeah, so I thought that was really funny. That was just kind of a ploy to draw out people who were looking for Ciri, but we did get some monster hunting, which I really liked. In terms of the actual audiobook, I thought the narrator did an excellent job. I think he conveyed the humor in the book a lot better than I was anticipating. I seem to remember with The Last Wish, there were some funny moments, but, I don't know. I don't know if it was as funny reading it as it was... these are obviously different books anyway, but I feel like listening to it was just a much more pleasant experience. And, I think the narrator does different voices for the characters pretty well. Ciri is kind of this higher pitched,
Ciri was the only one that I was that's a little goofy.
Yes, it was a little goofy, but I enjoyed it. And Geralt is kind of a gruff sort of tone. And then I think Yennefer and Trist, I maybe had a little bit of a harder time distinguishing his voices.
On the humor aspect, it's a little hard. I don't know how it does pull it off pretty well, but it's a little hard because a lot of characters are super self-serious. Geralt, Witchers do like to perpetuate the myth that they don't have human feelings and they can't be funny, but Geralt's a sarcastic asshole sometimes. So he can, he can joke, but he generally doesn't. And Yennefer takes herself super seriously. Triss doesn't really, but she's not funny. Ciri's series just funny and youthful exuberance. But it's interesting. It manages to have humor without really many funny characters, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
That makes sense. I mean, generally, I thought the audiobook was enjoyable, and I think, like I had kind of mentioned at the beginning of this video, I think I would like to continue on in the series listening to them. And yeah, it's definitely setting up a lot of stuff for, whatever's to come in the rest of the series. And I'm curious to see what happens next. Like, I don't think that this is like an all-time favorite series or anything like that, but I do really like the world and just like want more, I guess, stories in that, even if I'm not necessarily like as drawn into the main story itself. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I know where it goes. Some of it is depressing. Some of it is fun. I mean, the world in general is pretty depressing and sad.
Yes, it's kind of bleak.
Series story gets a lot less happy before it gets more happy. And, Geralt's story is basically looking for her. It kind of parallel. It's sort of like the Mandalorian, where he's looking for someone, and sort of it ends up sort of assembling a team of reluctant allies that just sort of want to help him out. But it's enjoyable through that. And there's also the underlying. There's always a lot of political scheming and people trying to pull one over on him. And Geralt has pretty simple goals, and knows when people are trying to pull one over on him, but is confident enough to go along with them and get himself out of stuff. It's good. I remember a lot of where it goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly like the end of this book is really ominous and like kind of foreboding. Like, it kind of mentions like Ciri thinks that something's going to happen. It's like, little did she know, ... It's like, oh shit, what's going to happen next? I don't know. Yeah. So for my birthday, Ivey just got me, it's like the Witcher video game compendium or something like that. And I think you had mentioned that there's like some spoilers, I think, for the book. So now I'm like, well, shit, I should... I should read the books before reading
big one.
before reading that. I'm excited for the show also, whenever that comes out.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what it'll be, but that show was really well done.
Yeah. So. I think that was a very good adaptation as far as adaptations go.
Henry Cavill does a good job making nerds think he's one of us.
Yes.
I don't know if you guys know, but he did film himself shirtlessly building a PC. Mm-hmm. So it's...
Yes, that's all. That's good. With that, I think we've kind of... this was not like a linear discussion, really, but that's what discussions are. Yeah. Yes, indeed. But yes, I think that'll do it for today. So I guess let us know in the comments if you've read this book and if you have any thoughts about The Witcher in general. Do you have a question of the day? Pop that. Surprise! I guess, how about for your question of the day, what's your favorite fantasy race? Because we have a lot of like really standard ones, I think, in here.
Well, yeah, for me it's elves, but the
elves
in this are less sympathetic.
Yeah. Yes, I agree with that. I do have a Discord channel, and if you want to join that, the link is in the description below. We hope you're all having an excellent day and are reading something awesome. And if you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a big thumbs up, because that would certainly help me out. But with that, I think we're going to wrap it up here and see you in the next one.
Bye, everybody.